So as I reach the end game of Jedi Survivor, there's a couple of skills that I really lean into and help me carry me through the game, as some just really make the game so easy. So we'll be going over these skills and the mechanics behind them, and without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so the first set of skills I'm going over are a category of skills which I like to call advanced parries. There's several skills I want to go over that meet these conditions, but in certain situations, you want to be using one over the other. So first is precision release. This is under the dual blade skill tree. If you release triangle right as an enemy hits, you'll do a follow-up attack and stagger nearby enemies. So right here we're testing against Monkey Boy, and as you see, the second attack I parried with precision release. It comes out pretty quickly, which does a follow-up 3-hit attack, which does decent damage. Now since this is a tougher enemy, the stagger effect isn't that long, but just long enough to get your attacks in. Now the one major downside is that it cannot block red attacks. So out of all the skills that I'm putting in this advanced parry category, this is probably the lowest tier one. The next one, however, has just a way better stun and can block red attacks. This one is called Parry Push, and it's under the Telekinesis skill tree. So no matter which stance that you prefer, you'll still be able to use this awesome skill. All you have to do is press R2 right before an enemy attack, and it'll basically blow back any enemy, no matter how big they are. And again, the reason why it's so good is because it can block red attacks and push them back at the same time. I found that this is kind of inconsistent. I think depending on the timing, sometimes the enemies get blown back, other times you just don't take damage, but the enemies keep attacking, so just something to keep in mind of. Now, a couple of downsides for using this skill is that one, it blows back enemies, so you do have to chase them down to get some damage in right after. Don't get me wrong, the stun is still pretty long, so you could get around 3 to 4 hits in, but for my recommendation, if you can't get an environmental kill and push enemies off the edge or something, really just play by a wall, as enemies do get stunned just a little bit longer and they don't get blown back as far, so you can get more hits in. The second downside is that it does cost force. I'm around endgame and it takes about a fifth of my force meter. I'd say that isn't too much because as you're getting hits in, you are gaining force, but it is something to keep in mind as it really isn't an infinite resource. One thing that does help with this, however, is the skill Power of Friendship. This makes it so that stims also refill some of your force meter. And as you see in the gameplay, it's not some force meter, it's around half of your bar of force. I think the max stims you can get is 11, and with the abundance of meditation points where you can refill these stims, sometimes it'll just make sense to use stims just to regain force. And moving on, the last advanced parry skill is in the blaster skill tree, and this one's called Point Blank. Press triangle just before an enemy hits to blast them away. Now this one's a little less consistent than the Parry Push. It can block some red attacks, but not all of them. As you can see in the gameplay, I think specifically red attack grabs are the ones you can't parry. However, as you can see, the one benefit of using this skill is, at least for this enemy, it doesn't blast them away. It sends them right in front of you, where you can get a lot more hits in. Because you are forced to use blaster stance, you definitely can't get as many hits as, say, the dual stance, but you're kind of forced to so you can get some ammo back. Keep in mind that if you switch stances and then you hit enemies, you don't get ammo back, so you're really stuck using blaster stance, which equates to less damage. But I'd say unlike Parry Push, which relies on force, Point Blank relying on ammo is a lot easier to replenish. So we're really sacrificing damage for more frequency of use. Now the good thing about this is that you don't have to use one or the other, you can use both. And this is the ideal playstyle that you want to be going for. If you're really trying to get damage in and thin out the mob, use the Parry Push so you can get that AoE attack to take down enemies quicker. If you're in more of a 1v1 situation against a higher level enemy, I'd say Point Blank is better as it's more consistent, and then just use each skill accordingly depending if the enemy is going for red attacks or normal attacks. And moving on to the next must-have skill at the end game. The skill is kind of broken, and with the abundance of ledges in the game, you can easily one-shot enemies. Whenever there's a fight where I'm just like, these enemies look a little tough, all you gotta do is find the nearest edge and boom, the fight is over. This skill is called Howling Push. Hold R2 to push enemies in a larger radius with a greater effect. Of course, since we're using force to use this ability, we're going to also need all these skills that increase our force meter. So under the Jedi concentration, you want Attunement, Lucid Attunement, and Enlightened Attunement. Now not only does this take out enemies in one shot when pushing them off the ledge, but there's also environmental kills that you can do, which are just so satisfying. but I'd say most of the time you're going to be getting those ledge kills. Little tip for this is just kind of kite enemies into a line. I said the AI isn't that smart, so it's pretty easy to do, and then push them off. Sometimes it takes a couple of times, but still the ability to one-shot enemies is just way too powerful. Next, as you press through the game, you'll also unlock this ability in the Telekinesis skill called Power Lift. This lets you lift any enemy in the air, which is especially useful if there's things like guardrails. The Power Lift to Howling Push combo is a simple fix to the guardrails problem, or my favorite if you just don't want to deal with multiple pushes, group everyone up, suspend them in place, and go for that push. Both of these skills have a very large AoE, so you can affect a lot of enemies at once. In combination, these are probably the two best skills that will carry you through the game if you're having any trouble. Alright, the next skill that we're going to go over is kind of a basic one, but still carries its weight throughout the end game. And this is your basic Reflect. The ability to reflect blaster shots and basically take out lower level enemies in one shot is still so useful. Now, as you've seen in the gameplay, but you can also split the blaster shot into two, taking out two enemies for reflecting one shot. Now there are several skills that give you this ability. First is under the dual wield skill tree called Split Reflection. The other is under the single blade skill tree, and this one's called Twofold Reflection. These are the only two skill trees that provide this effect. Double blade has something similar called Multifold Reflections, but is still a 1-for-1 shot to reflection. Blaster doesn't need it because you can obviously just shoot enemies, and Crossblade has the skill Charge Reflection, which reflects an AoE shot, but the AoE is very small and not useful at all. And so even against enemies that don't get one shot, all the way into the end game you'll be finding enemies that shoot blasters that can be reflected, and really that is just free damage. You just hold block and reflect shots, that does drain your stamina meter, but if you do parry them and reflect them back, it takes hardly any meter at all. Really the only downside is that you have to be using these single or dual wield blade styles, but because you can equip two stances and because dual wield is pretty damn strong, I don't think this is much of a hindrance. Alright, next into the final skill that will carry you throughout the end game, and this is your basic Confusion. If you go up the skill tree, we need Addled Mind, Greater Confusion, Superior Confusion, and then Confusion Mastery. Now this ability really comes into play when there are multiple enemies that you have to fight at once. Just use Confusion on the strongest one and they'll be fighting for you instead. And in certain situations you really could just AFK and just sit back and watch the fight. If the enemy that you confuse can take on all the other enemies, again thinning out the mob is such a useful ability. Now I wanted to go over the major and obvious drawback, and that is that it only affects living creatures. So any droids, it does not affect. Given that maybe half of the enemies that you encounter are droids, I'd say this will only work 50% of the time. You'll definitely get an icon that notifies you that you can't confuse this target, but I'd say in most fights you can at least confuse one target, even if it isn't the strongest one. If anything, they'll just provide a nice distraction and at least take out some of the health for the harder hitting enemies to make it that much easier to take them down. Now in the end game, you're going to be finding these tears where you're going to be fighting large groups of enemies or a couple of very hard hitting enemies. I'm not going to spoil them in this video, but this is the perfect place. Again, it doesn't work on all enemies, but for the enemies that it does work on, it makes these tears a lot easier and manageable. And so with that, I hope you guys found this video. Hopefully if you did, please drop a like and consider subscribing. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Hope to catch you in the next one, and see you.